In MVC, you can apply the output cache attribute to an action method that you call using either the HTML action or HTML render action helper methods. The effect is to cache the output of the child action method independently of the page. Output cache has properties that hook into virtually all of the ASP.NET caching features, with the exception of the vary by control property, which really wouldn't make sense in MVC since a server control is a bit of an irrelevant concept. Output caching is implemented as an action filter attribute, like others you've seen throughout this MVC4 course. It works by storing the output of controller actions and returns those cached results instead of re-executing the actions on subsequent calls. Like other caching techniques, this can boost performance when a page consists of a lot of information generated dynamically from databases or other resources, such as web services. In a heavily used website, even cache durations of a few seconds can have a big impact on performance, depending on what's going on behind the scenes in order to generate the data that makes up the page. As with most action filters, you can apply the attribute to individual action methods or to a controller to have it apply to all its action methods. Usually, though, it makes more sense to apply it to individual methods, but it really depends on the application and how it can benefit from output caching. So let's see how this works in its simplest form. All right, I'll go ahead and run the application, show you what this does first. As you can see, I have a number of output cache demos. So I'll click on the first one. Here's simple caching. And you can see that the page was created at a specific time. I'll go ahead and refresh this, and notice that the time doesn't change. There it just changed, because I set this cache to expire after 10 seconds. So I'll continue to hit this. 15, 26. Okay, so it just changed again. So very simple example. I'm caching the output from this particular action method, in this case the simple caching output method, and caching it for 10 seconds. Okay. All right, so here's the action method behind that. So all the simple caching is doing is it's just returning the view, not doing any processing here. But this is the important part. There's the output cache, and I've set the duration to 10 seconds. And further, by omission, I'm specifying that it's not going to vary based on any other parameters. Now, keep in mind that you may see code where code includes a vary by parameter set equal to null. In earlier versions of MVC, you had to include that parameter even if you weren't varying by parameter. So just keep that in mind. That's no longer required. Okay, let's go over and take a look at that view. So it's called simple caching. As you can see, what I'm doing is I'm just displaying the current time and converting it to a long time string. So what happens is when I run the application and I click the simple caching link on the index view, you see the current time. And then, as you refresh the page, this entire view is cached, again because I included this output cache attribute on the action method. And so if I run this again, now you can understand the behavior. So I'll click on simple caching, it's regenerated, seconds are 19, and I'll refresh, still 19, refresh, 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 and finally we go to 29 because 10 seconds elapsed. And so this entire view is being cached. And the way this works is that as long as the cached view hasn't expired, MVC doesn't even execute the method. So to prove that to you, I'll go back over to Visual Studio, and I'll put a breakpoint on the return view, and then go back over to Internet Explorer and refresh. The reason it hit here is because the cached item had expired. And now when I refresh again, as long as it's cached, refresh, and there I hit it again. Continue, and then refresh again, I don't hit it. So I'm only hitting it when that 10-second time period expires, and it needs to regenerate the cached item. And continue again. So it's important to understand that it's not even running the action method when you include the output cache parameter. Only when the cache view expires did I hit the breakpoint. Okay, so that's simple caching. One very nice variation of this is that you don't have to define output caching, all its parameters, within the action method. Because, for example, say I have 50 action methods in this controller, and I want to cache all of them for 10 seconds. But there's other action methods, so I don't want to put the output cache attribute on the controller. Okay, so in that case, I would have to put the output cache on all of those output methods, or the action methods. And then if I decide that I want to cache the data for 15 seconds, I need to change that for each individual action method. But there's a better way. So a nice option of this output cache filter is that instead of defining the characteristics of the cache for every action method, you can define one or more profiles within web.config. That way, when you have to change the caching characteristics, you can change them in one place rather than throughout the application. So if I go over here into web.config, open that up, and you can see that within system.web, I have a caching element, output cache settings, and output cache profiles, and I'm defining a profile called 10-second cache profile. And I'm setting the duration to 10 seconds here, but I can include other attributes if I want to use them. So the other attributes that are supported by the output cache attribute. Okay, so I have this defined within the web.config already. So I can come back over here into Home Controller. I can comment out that output cache and use this one instead. And now if I run the application, I'll go into simple caching again, and I get the exact same behavior. So 58 seconds. And there we finally went past 10 seconds. So I get the same behavior, but because I've defined the caching characteristics within web.config as a profile, I can use that profile in multiple action methods and then just have to change it in one place if I need to change that duration or add other properties or whatever I need to do. And the result is a much more maintainable application. Now, one caution about this technique, though. You can't use the regular ASP.NET @output cache attribute within the page directive within a view. The reason is that the action method executes before a view is even selected. So if I close this down and go back over to the view here, we don't even have a page directive in MVC views. You can use it if you want to, but it's kind of going against the grain of how MVC operates. But if you did include it, the output cache directive is going to work to cache the contents of the view, but the action method will still run every single time. Since the method is where all of the action happens with extracting and manipulating data, regenerating that cached data that makes up the view, the benefit of caching is going to be negligible if you just cache the view using that directive. Instead, use the attribute on the action method, and you get the full benefit of that caching. Okay, so this is a simple example of caching. But the hard part of using caching is to select the right properties and settings to define the cache so that it's most effective for the page and its content. Output cache has a lot of properties that you can tweak, including SQL dependency, to make the cache dependent on the state of data within a SQL Server database. Okay, now I need to talk a little bit about caching limitations. Because as nice as these caching features are, there are limits to what you can do, particularly with the caching profile. Okay, so let's take a look at another view here. It's called Get Cached Time. So this view displays the current and cached times. So the current time is just directly executing this date time now to long time string. And for the cached time, it's executing this action method called getTime. So the code within this page does something you're not typically going to do, but it demonstrates these concepts, is the code uses a datetime object directly in the view, but then uses an action method for the second time. Okay, if we go back over here to Home Controller, here's the getCached_time. So that's the action method behind the view that initially loads the page. And then here's the getTime. So this is the child action method that's used by the view. Again, if we go back in here, that's that child action method right there. So this is what is executed. So I initially have an output cache with a duration of 10. And so this is going to cache this view for 10 seconds. So this is the identical situation to the simple example that I showed you previously. Okay, and so the information is cached for 10 seconds. Okay, so I'll run this application again and go into getCached_time child method. And I have the two times. They're initially in sync. I'll refresh the page. The current time is updated, but the cache time doesn't change because it's cached for 10 seconds. And there it finally changed. And I continue to go there, refresh again, continue on, and they're once again in sync. So you can see the behavior of that. Okay, so far so good. But unfortunately, this child action output caching doesn't work with named caching profiles that are defined in web.config. So I'll close the application, and I'll come here and comment out this output cache and enable that one. And that uses that same 10-second cache profile as I used in this previous example. I'll go ahead and run the page again and click on that same link, and we get an exception. And the exception says duration has to be a positive number. So the problem is that using this on a child action method, using that cache profile, doesn't work. It sees that the data is being cached. So if I go back over to our Home Controller, it sees that I'm using the output cache attribute, but it's not able to read that duration from the caching profile. So just kind of a gotcha with using profiles and the output cache object. Okay, but despite its foibles, the caching feature in MVC that's built on top of the ASP.NET caching features can be a huge boon for web server performance and easing the workload on server resources, particularly if the cached code hits a database or performs other processor-intensive activities. And there are various other options that you can use that makes for some very flexible caching. So let's talk about those options now. So there are several parameters that you can use with the output cache attribute. And these are the same parameters that are supported by the ASP.NET Cache object, except for vary by control. So for the most part, MVC is just surfacing the features of that object. Okay, so you've seen duration and cache profile. Just showed you an example of those. There's also an enabled option. So you can use this to turn on and off output caching. Makes it a little bit simpler than commenting out an output cache. Then there's a child action cache. And this gets or sets the child action cache. So you have some flexible options for specifying how the child action is cached. And then there's location, which gets or sets the location where the data is cached. And I'll have more to say about that shortly. No store is an option that gets or sets a value that indicates whether to store the cache. And it works by enabling or disabling the HTTP cache control header. Another option is SQL dependency. This gets or sets the SQL dependency so that you can have the cache depend on the contents of data within a database table. And then there are some vary by parameters. The first one is vary by content encoding. And this gets or sets the vary by content encoding value, which is a comma-delimited list of character sets, which are content encodings. So for different languages and different cultures. You can use vary by custom, which gets or sets the vary by custom value, which is a set of custom strings so that you can have very fine-grained control over how things are cached. You can vary by header, which it gets or sets the vary by header value, which is a comma-delimited list of HTTP header names. So when you get a request in, you can cache items based on headers that you get with the request. And then there's a vary by param. This gets or sets the vary by param value, which is a semicolon delimited list of form, post, or query string parameters. And this is a very powerful option because, for example, you can cache an action method based on product ID 10, for example. And so every time a user requests information about product 10, they get the cached value. But if they request information about product 15, then they get a fresh set of data because the vary by param looks at that parameter value and then varies the cached item that's returned based on that ID value. All right, so those are all the parameters that you can use. You can use them in various combinations, which provides a lot of flexibility for caching content. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the output cache location option. There's several options that you can use here, which are members of the output cache location enumeration. What this does is it ultimately sets the value of the HTTP cacheability enumeration, which sets the value of the cache control HTTP header. As usual, there's no magic here. ASP.NET and MVC are just hooking into the underlying HTTP infrastructure. So the first option is any, and this is the default. So all the examples that I've shown you so far have been any. In this case, the output cache can be located on the browser client where the request originated, on a proxy server or any other server, participating in the request, or on the server where the request was processed. And this value corresponds to the HTTP cacheability public enumeration value. Another option is client. In this case, the output cache is going to be located on the browser client where the request originated. And this value corresponds to the HTTP cacheability private enumeration. Another option is downstream. In this case, the output cache can be stored in any HTTP 1.1 cache-capable device other than the origin server. So that includes proxy servers as well as the client, the browser, that made the original request. Another option is a server. So the output cache is located on the web server where the request was processed. And this value corresponds to the HTTP cacheability server enumeration value. Yet another option is server and client. In this case, the output cache can be stored only at the origin server or the requesting client. So proxy servers aren't allowed to cache the response. And this value corresponds to the combination of the HTTP cacheability private and server enumeration values. And then the final option is none. In this case, the output cache is disabled for the page that the user requested. And this value corresponds to the HTTP cacheability no cache enumeration value. Now, interestingly, the HTTP cacheability default is private, so the cache is only on the client. So as a result, any is the default for a reason. It works in most situations, but not always, so you're going to need to test to see what is most appropriate for your application. All right, so let's take a look at how you can use some of these options. Now I'm going to show you how you can take advantage of the caching location option. So I'll start out by running the application again and selecting caching location. All right, as you can see, it says, please log in and return to this page. So I'm going to go log in. So this is just a regular standard MVC4 internet application. So it uses forms-based authentication. And what I actually need to do is register, because I haven't created an account here yet. Okay, so I'll create username, Don Kiley, password, I'll use the highly unsecure sled dogs, and register, and that logs me in. And so as usual, again, this is the default application for an MVC4 out of the box template. It says, hello, Don Kiley, and I have the option of logging off. So now I can come over here and go to cache location. Well, wait a second. It says register, log in. Log in. Well, something's wrong. Well, let me go back to home. Well, wait a second. It says, hello, Don Kiley, and I have the log off. If I go back to caching location, it looks like I'm not logged in. Well, yeah. The problem is that it caches the entire page, so the view is not being recreated each time. Okay, so clearly I have a problem with my caching as I currently have it defined. Okay, so one of the things I can do is click on this link to clear the output cache. And I'll refresh the page. And now it sees that I'm logged in. The page had to be recreated. And so it picked up the correct information that I am, in fact, logged in as Don Kiley. Okay, but it gets even worse. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this URL. And this time I'll open up Chrome and paste it in and go to that page. Oh, now that's a problem. Because I'm in an entirely different browser. It shows that I'm logged in as Don Kiley. And in a real page, I might have my profile information, that is my home address and phone number and social security number and all kinds of ripe information for identity theft. So if somebody else goes into this and I've cached that page inappropriately. And I can refresh and, yep, all my sensitive information is still there. Okay, so this isn't good. I'll go to the home page and notice the home page isn't cached, and so I have to register or log in. If I go back over to caching location, it still says I'm logged in as Don Kiley. So, yikes. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is close both of these browsers and go into the home controller and come down here to the caching location. And now I'm going to comment out this attribute and use this one instead. So what this output cache attribute does is it keeps the duration at 180 seconds, but it specifies the location of the data is going to be cached on the client. And it also is setting no store to true. So the net result of these parameters is that the data is only going to be cached in the client browser. Okay, so I'll run the application again. And I'll go to the caching location. And notice that I am cached as being logged in. I'll refresh the page. And now it's regenerated the page because the cache has expired. And so it now properly shows that I'm not currently logged in for this user session. Okay, now I'm going to log in again. And go back to caching location. And notice it now, once again, properly shows me as logged in. And once again, I can copy the URL. This time I'll go to Firefox just for something different. Paste and go. And because the page is cached within Internet Explorer on the browser, it's not available here within Firefox because the different browsers don't share browser cache locations. We now have the proper situation. So the moral of this story is that you want to cache data appropriately for the data and the page, the information that's there. Personal data should always be cached on the client, with some caveats if it's truly sensitive data. But site-wide data that's shared amongst users should be cached on the server, or both the client and the server. Another one of the output cache options is vary by param. This lets you cache multiple versions of an action method based on request parameters. So a very common use for this is to cache the results of passing an ID value for an item, customer ID, a product item, any kind of individual item that you want to display information about within the view. Now, with regular caching, you'll always get the same data no matter what ID value is requested. But when you use vary by param, then the data for customer ID 10 is cached. And if a user requests information about customer 20, then that data will be regenerated afresh because it looks at the parameter value and sees that you don't want the cached value 10 and reads the database or whatever it needs to do to go out and get information about object ID 20. All right, so the values that you can use are none at all, literally the word none, star, or a parameter name. And if you use multiple parameter names, you delimit with a semicolon. Now this option only works with query string or post parameters. This is probably the most confusing part of vary by param, and frankly one that I had to grapple with when I was starting to work with MVC. The important thing to understand is that the cache object caches things based on the URL, with or without any query string parameters or post parameters, which remember are passed as HTTP headers instead of in the URL. So consider these two partial URLs. The first one is a typical MVC route with controller, action, and ID. The second one is also usable in MVC, but contains the ID value as a query string. The first URL isn't usable with vary by param because each URL is unique. The second one is usable with vary by param because there's a query string parameter, but the important thing is that the path home/product remains the same. Okay, so let's see how this works. Okay, here I am back in the caching application. I'll go ahead and run this first so I show you what it does. And in this case, I have some different options for using caching parameters. So I'll click on the first one here, which is going to request, if you look at the URL at the bottom left corner of the screen, so this is going to go to home caching parameters /10. And I'm not currently actually using any caching. All right, so this is what the application does. So it displays that product ID 10. Remember that home caching parameters 10, so it's picking up the ID value there. And then it is indicating how many items we have in stock. And as you'll see when I show you the code, I'm just randomly generating that number, just to simulate that going to a database, doing whatever processing is required to get that inventory number. All right, so I can refresh the page, and notice that it takes a little bit of time. If you were counting, about 5 seconds. And now we have 47. And I'll refresh again. It takes another roughly 5 seconds. Now we have 40. And refresh one more time. It takes about another 5 seconds. So what I'm doing in the sample is I'm actually putting the thread to sleep for 5 seconds, just to give it a little bit of a delay so that we can clearly tell the difference when cache data is being retrieved, because we get a response immediately, as opposed to when the action method actually has to run to simulate going out and doing a complex query against some remote database. Okay? So again, I'm not currently using any caching within this page. All right, so I'll go back to home, click on another link here. Takes time to load the page as well as that 5-second delay, And now we have product ID 15. We have 75 in stock. Just to prove the point, another 5 seconds. And go back and have a third option. And this is just going out and getting information about product 20. Okay, so that's what the sample application does. So let's take a look at the code. So here's that caching parameters. Notice that I have different forms of the output cache attribute, but all of them are commented out. So this is the uncached version of the action method. All right, so we're getting the ID in. Here's where I'm randomly generating the inventory number, so it's going to be between 0 and 100. And I'm using the current milliseconds as seed to the random number generator. So random enough for this application. And here's where I put the thread to sleep for 5 seconds. So that's why we get that delay when this action method is not cached. And then put a message within ViewBag that includes that ID value as well as our bogus inventory amount. Okay, very simple. And the view, all it does is it displays that message. All right, so let's take a look at caching this for 3,600 seconds, so quite a bit of time. And I'll run the page again. And I'll click on the 10 once again. So it takes the roughly 5 seconds to generate the inventory amount. And now we have 79 in stock. As you can see, our inventory varies quite a bit. And I'll refresh, and we get an instant response. Refresh again, and each time we have 79 in stock. So clearly the action method is not being called. Okay, so we're caching the page, the action method, everything is great. Okay, so I'm going to make a note that we currently have 79 of item 10. Okay, let's go back to home, click on 15. Once again, we get the 5-second delay on top of the normal loading the view and so forth. And make a note that 15, we have 73. And refresh a couple times. Okay, caching is working. All is well. And go look at 20. And right now we have 72 in stock. Now, a little bit coincidentally, so we have 79 of 10, 73 of 15, and 72 of 20. So I can go back over here, revisit this page again, and 15, we still have 73. Okay, that's good. And item 10, we still have 79. Okay, so everything is cached as we expect. But what's important to note here is that we're caching it based on the URL. And the 10 is part of the URL. And so we're getting item 10 and 79. So we're not just caching the entire action method because the URLs vary. So that shows how the caching is linked to the actual URL. Okay, so let's go back over to our code here. And let's see how vary by param works. So I'm going to comment out that statement and uncomment that one. So now we're still caching for a long time, but now we're using the vary by param ID. So I'll run it again. And once again, click on 10. Well, that took no time, so the action method didn't execute. Okay, well, so maybe that's the first one that we got. So previously we had 79 in stock, so that number hasn't changed. I'll go back to the home and 15. We get that immediately. Well, that's weird, but we're caching by ID, varying by parameter. There. 20, 72. No, that's our previous result. So we're getting the exact same behavior. So apparently vary by param doesn't work. Well, no. That's because the URLs have no query string parameters to vary by. Again, including a URL of this form is not a query string parameter. All right, so that's why I had the second set of links here. So if I hover over this, notice down in the lower left corner you can see that I'm still accessing the caching parameters action method, but now I'm using ID equals 10 as a query string parameter. So I'll click on that link. That's a different URL that I haven't visited yet, so I have the 5-second delay because the action method is executing. And now item 10 has 4 in stock. I'll make a note of that. And I'll refresh the page. We still have 4 in stock, comes back immediately. Okay, so now we're getting the cached action method. Come back over here to 15, 5-second delay. We haven't been to this URL yet. It's varying by parameter, so the action method is executing. And item 15, we have 2 in stock. And caching works. And once again, go to 20, 5-second delay. And we end up with 12 items in stock. Okay, so now we have the expected behavior. It's actually caching it by parameter and using that setting there. But in order to do that, I had to have that second set of links that pass the ID as a query string rather than using the default route defined within the MVC4 application. Okay, so another option with vary by param is none. And that tells ASP.NET not to vary by any parameter values. So I'll comment out that form of the attribute and select this one instead. So I'll run the application again, and I'll click on the first set of links. Okay, we're still getting the cached value. And there I refresh, and I'm getting a fresh value. And I'll refresh again, and now we stick with the refreshed value. Go home and go to 15, and we're getting that cache value. If I refresh, it regenerates it once again. So I'm generally getting the same behavior as before, which is expected because I'm using a different URL. So again, these aren't using query strings, so it caches based on the full URL, which has different ID values. Okay, let's go home again and use the second set of strings. So I'll click on 10, and I'll refresh. And refresh again, and so far so good. But now I'll go to 15, and I'll refresh that, and notice that I'm getting product ID 10, even though I passed in 15. So it's returning the previous value. And yep, that's the correct behavior in this case, although it really doesn't work for the page, but it's correct behavior because I told ASP.NET to cache the action method output, ignoring parameter values. So with this set of links, that second set of links, they're passed in as query string identifiers. So it's caching the information just based on the base path. It's ignoring the query string values. And so that's why, even though I'm requesting 15, it's returning the cached value. Okay, so you see, you kind of have to be careful with how you use these, particularly as they relate to the form of the URLs that you're using. And then another option for vary by param is star, which means to cache based on any different query string parameter values.